Good morning, everyone. It is me, Joshua Caruso, with the San Diego Cannabis Farmers Market. Thank you for joining us today on our first virtual job fair, but this is actually our third annual Southern California Cannabis and Hemp Career Fair and Business Expo. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate all your support. This morning, we have our first speaker by the name of Matthew Gates. Matthew Gates is a cannabis IPM specialist. He works in other plants besides cannabis, but today we're going to be focusing on cannabis. And he's with he owns Zenthanol Consulting. That's a local consulting agency that deals with plant and IPM management. And we're very honored and happy to have him as a speaker today. So, with no further ado, we're going to go ahead and present Matthew as a speaker. Go ahead, Matthew.
Hey everyone, my name is Matthew Gates, and I'm going to have a presentation about current and future pests in the cannabis space. I have here a presentation, so let me just start it for you. All right, I just want to check that it is visible. I think that it is. So I'm going to start here. So the name of this presentation is Cannabis Pest Update 2021, the Everswarm, Holistic Identification and Countermeasures from Gene to Gram. You can find my social media when I do science communication about plant health on Instagram and Twitter at SyncAngel. And you can also find a lot of my information on my YouTube channel, Zenthanol, which, as Jay mentioned, is the name of my Zenthanol Consulting group. So I wanted to first start off with asking a question. What is a pest exactly? This might seem an overly simple question, but it's actually very complex. And it's a question that often gets a lot of, I guess you could say, it gets a lot of sort of tenuous contention because people just assume that any kind of bug in their grow could be a potential threat. And while I commend that sort of perspective about being vigilant, which is very important for pest abatement, not every organism in your area is going to be a pest. So we should acknowledge that pest is a human concept. And as I've written here, in agriculture, a biotic agent that threatens the human intention of cultivation. However, natural interactions are more complex than binary pest beneficial dichotomy. So we usually think of things as good or bad, or better or worse, but the world of ecology is way more complex than this. And indeed, things like the microbiome is incredibly complex. So you've got insects and mites and nematodes and bacteria, fungi, oomycetes, viruses. They facilitate or impair cultivator intent. So recognizing what they are and what you're dealing with is integral to saving costs on applications or biocontrols, whether it's a chemical application, a biological application, or some other technique that you're using to get rid of pests. It would be very unfortunate, and I've seen it very often, where people see something that is not a problem, like a predatory mite in their soil or a springtail, and they freak out and they try to control it, not knowing that it's not really a problem. And people spend a lot of money unnecessarily, and they also will become very stressed out, which might lead to other problems in cultivation. So, again, it's very important to identify problems as much as possible, as easily as possible. I practice what I like to call holistic integrated pest management. So that acknowledges this complexity that I'm talking about. And I want to also talk about something called a symbiosis. Many people hear the word symbiosis and they assume it means something that's good. Symbioses are actually everything from the spectrum of parasite to mutualist. So, generally, a thing that's harming the plant or causing dysfunction, or has a context that is generally detrimental to the plant rather than beneficial. But how we define that can also be somewhat muddled. On the other side of the spectrum, You have beneficial, and again, sometimes a beneficial organism can have some detrimental effects as well. And as we learn more about how plants interact with their environment, we learn more about how this actually occurs and that it is not static but dynamic and it can change over time. Some research topics I have here, you can look up yourself. I brought them here because they sort of challenge some of the dichotomies, some of the false dichotomies about beneficial and detrimental organisms. So we have an example in the yellow, which is of mycorrhiza-induced susceptibility to viruses in particular. So the mycorrhizal fungi that we normally think of as beneficial, in some cases, can make pathogens more make it more easy for pathogens to be virulent and to infect the plant. So that's just something to consider. The blue, our research reports about how biodiverse microbiome dynamics actually are. So, for example, the importance of viruses in the soil, believe it or not, since bacteria are so important, so too are the viruses that often encode for genes that actually allow the bacteria to be beneficial to the plant or to be competitive with other bacteria and other microbes as well. And also other microbes like protists and things that work in synergy with fungi and plants to mine nutrients and things out of the soil. And in a lot of cases, the potential of the relationship that a plant can have with microbes is limited without a more diverse complement of microbes too. And of course, if you learn anything from this slide about microbiome interactions in particular, I would encourage you to search for the term plant soil feedback. It is this concept of of the plant and the soil sort of having this dynamic interaction, and what happens in the soil and what happens to the plant and its response to like stressors and things can actually cause other plants that grow in the soil to have a different life essentially. And those influences from the previous grows, from the previous organisms, will affect the future of those compositions, and more than just simply um, uh, sort of facilitating certain microbes. There's actually more to it than that. I also want to apologize up front that some of my videos and things will not activate on this presentation because of how it's set up. But but you can check out most of my videos and footage on my YouTube channel as well. So I just want to get that part out of the way. If you're interested in any of that information, you can check it out there. So pest biodiversity, right? So I wanted to start with the ancient history first and come to here very quickly. So cannabis and hops are often, people know that they're both Cannabaceae. People also know that they're closely related. But what a lot of people don't realize is actually, as far as we can tell, cannabis and hops actually speciated from a common ancestor about 20 million years ago, maybe 30 million years ago, maybe 27, maybe 22. The molecular clock estimates are a little bit, they're a little bit non-specific, but they're about this time period. So actually, that's relatively recent in the span of evolution of the entire Cannabaceae family and also plants in general. So cannabis speciated at this point, and it rapidly moved across the Eurasian continent. So from like perhaps like a Central Asian location, a lot of places like to say near the Qinghai Lake in what is now China, and moving out towards the Indian subcontinent and to sort of Eastern Asia and Northeastern Asia, as well as sort of Central and Western Eurasia. This is all before humans got involved in this. Indeed, that would be in the last maybe 8 to 9 million years ago when humans started to speciate as well. So this was all happening way before then. So pests, of course, were documented when humans started to cultivate cannabis. Of course, we don't have the documentation and things like that, but people would see insects and other organisms and problems when they were cultivating these plants as early as 10,000 years ago, and perhaps earlier than that, we have documentation in various places. So we do know that this happened. And despite more scientific documentation that's existed for maybe 200 plus years or so, um, we still don't know a whole lot about the various cannabis pests that exist. But this paper called Hemp Pest Spectrum and Potential Relationship Between Helicobacter Infestation and Hemp Production in the United States in the Face of Climate Change goes over a lot of the various organisms that people are liable to come across. And this is a great resource for anyone who's trying to um, avail themselves of the various pests that they could encounter. So Helicobacter, by the way, is the budworm moth that a lot of people are familiar with. Here we have on the left side here, you can see that there's a family, various families of these insects in particular, arthropods rather. So you have things like grasshoppers and thrips and the cannabis aphid, of course, and the aphid family. You've got spittlebugs and cucumber beetles. You've got, like I said here, the European corn borer, which is also another budworm type moth. You've got the myriadae, the tarnished plant bugs, corn earworms, stink bugs, all kinds of things. Broad mites, two-spot spider mite, the Eurasian hemp borer in particular, being a pretty big problem lately. All of these insects have been documented feeding on cannabis. So the takeaway here is that there are a lot of pests of cannabis. There are specialists that are very good at what they do, but there are also many generalists that are also able to feed on cannabis. But you've also got beneficial arthropods as well. And for those who don't know, an arthropod is like an insect or a mite, or a few other organisms kind of fall into this group, but they're those armored sort of insect-like organisms that you're probably very familiar with. So arthropod is sort of a larger group that encompasses mites and insects, for example. So we've got here beneficials like various spiders. You've got the Anthocoridae, or the insidious flower bugs. You might also know them as Orius, which is a very common genus that is commercially available for taking care of thrips and other sorts of pest species that can parasitize plants. You've got braconid wasps, very many parasitoid wasps that go after aphids and whiteflies and things like this. Green lacewings are very common. Tiger beetles are perhaps less common, but also a massive predator of things like caterpillars, for example. You've got various lady beetles, although I do want to say here that Harmonia axaridis here is the harlequin lady beetle at the very end of this list, and I would not recommend people utilizing them because um, they're harvested in a destructive way, and they also outcompete other native lady beetles, and they can also eat them, and they can also transmit diseases, believe it or not. And they also bite humans. So all around, not a great lady beetle, but the other ones are a little bit better. A lot of organisms that we would consider to be problematic, like flies, for example, are actually sometimes predatory. And so if you can learn what these look like, learn the good ones from the bad ones, then you are going to be more effective. If you are trying to grow in a space holistically using native plants, then that is also going to help you attract the native beneficials that are adapted to your location. Um, some tips that I have here about that, about creating what are called banker plants, is to use species with small florets for example, parasitoid wasps and flies and solitary bees, which are all very important for the environment and are also going to be very influential for your environment. You can also produce pollen plants like peppers, for example. I have a video on my YouTube channel that goes over research into a couple of different cultivars of ornamental peppers. And exploding ember pepper plant was very good at keeping type 3 predatory mites like Swirsky, Cucumeris, these other predatory mites that are commercially available that feed on a wide range of pests like thrips and whiteflies and broad mites and russet mites that a lot of people have a lot of trouble dealing with. But when the pests are away, there has to be a way to maintain them. And one way to do that is to have these plants that are able to produce pollen that serve as a resource for them to feed on in addition to the pests as well. And here would be a video that I had about a syrphid fly larva. They often look like caterpillars, and you can check out the video on my YouTube channel. But knowing them from caterpillars can help save you a ton of time and resources. It can also be a signal to you that aphids are here, because syrphid fly larvae, like I see here, they are very voracious and they will feed on many aphids. And it's a problem that many people deal with. You also deal with things that are not really a problem, but they are still found in cannabis fields. I won't go over these too much, but knowing these can also help you because you know not to really deal with them or worry about them too much. Things like rove beetles, which actually I would consider to be a beneficial because a lot of them are predatory. You've also got things like various butterflies that just because they are on or around your plants doesn't mean that the larvae that they produce, the caterpillars, are going to be feeding on your plants. And this information is not exhaustive, but as the research comes out more, we'll have more information to reference. I also want to say that at the bottom here, these leaf mining flies um, are also something I would call a pest and not a neutral organism, because I have definitely encountered leaf miner flies on cannabis, and they do parasitize the leaves. So why train in pest ecology? So if you're a professional organization, then having your staff, your cadre, know what is a pest, what is not a pest, and how to deal with those pests, it's going to increase your biosecurity, of course, and it's going to decrease your long-term costs. A lot of people don't think about their security situation until it's too late. And speaking from personal experience, most of the calls that I get in a professional capacity are damage control. The problem has already occurred, and at that point, it becomes a case of controlling the damage that's already there and making a lot of hard choices that are very costly or have already been quite costly, thousands of dollars. So if you're able to make some sort of a preventative move and know what products and services are actually going to be useful, taking an analytical approach very much will help you. So understanding things like ecology, understanding things like even things like marketing, not rolling over for no data. For example, like I've written here, it allows you to analyze, confirm, or refute marketing claims for product or service implementation. I have two examples here. Um, on the left, there is this Agranova. This is I'm not against them or anything like this, but I happen to see this advertisement, so they get to they get to bear the brunt of this, which is that they have an explanation here for Tetranechus urticae, so a mite that is, as they say here, a mite or a pest very important in various areas of the world. So this is actually a depiction of a whirligig mite, which is not a spider mite. In fact, it's a beneficial mite that goes after aphids and other small arthropods on your plants. They probably Googled red mite, didn't know the difference, and posted it here as an advertisement. And if you know the difference, then that might make you ask your question, well, are these people going to be effective? Are the organisms that they're applying, do they know what they're even doing? you know, of course, these departments might not be connected, but it should raise a red flag potentially if you're seeing such an overt sort of mistake there. On the other side, we have this is a claim made by Kangen water. Um, Kangen water is often depicted as having a lot of beneficial effects, mostly through either oxidative effects or through hydration. But some of the claims don't seem to match up with certain physiological realities about plants. And for example, I have research here. The claim that I'm talking about here is where it says that molecular hydrogen acts as an efficient antioxidant that diffuses rapidly across cell membranes and can reduce free radicals, suppressing oxidative stress. Whether that's true or not, rapid movement of water into the cells is actually a pretty bad thing. Cells tend to they can get water through what's called passive diffusion, but generally They gain water through aquaporins, which are little channels that they control the movement of water through. And if something is able to bypass that, that can have incredibly deleterious effects on the plant cell. Very similar to how you can very much harm yourself with water toxicity if you drink too much water. It is possible and it does happen. So it's a similar kind of thing here. Similarly, um, although we often think of oxidative stress as being a problem, and indeed it can be, oxidants and antioxidants are also very tightly controlled and finely tuned in plant cells. And so if you're also altering the oxidative quality of the internal cell and the cytoplasm, this can actually cause problems with regards to immune response signaling. As I put here, and I encourage people to read the significance of reactive oxygen species and antioxidant defense system in plants, a concise overview by Dumanovic. This is a really great research, and it goes over the fine details of why this might not be something that you want exactly. So again, on the surface, something might seem appropriate and good, but you should ask them how they know that it's good, why it is the case that it is, and if they can't give you research or empirical data that is relevant to what they're talking about in a very specific way, then that can be very problematic, and you might not want to spend your money or resources moving with these sorts of services or products. It just depends on what you come across, and so having an analytical mind, having a pest-oriented mindset will allow you to forego certain biosecurity risks altogether. And why that important is because pest pressure has been increasing gratuitously in cannabis. This is again from the former research report I was talking about with the list of the pests and beneficials. You can see here that just based on the organization sampled between 2015 and 2018, hemp greenhouse space, which is only a small amount of the total amount of cannabis being grown in the USA and globally, right? Increased 12,000%, or sorry, 1,200%. That would have been even more egregious. 1,200% at minimum. That's quite a bit, and it signals that cannabis is, of course, becoming more and more popular, and it also signals to us that we should be much more aware of the ramifications of that, which is that as it gets expanded out and there isn't really infrastructure for people getting support, either through research about what products might be good for pest abatement and things like that, as well as infrastructural support that's financial or through simply people having access to universities and other researchers and agencies that can support them. Um, Cannabis, of course, is often lacking in that, and for understandable reasons, historically through prohibition. So, as the population of cannabis increases, then the population of pests will also increase. And if people are ill suited to combat those pests, then those pests are going to become other people's problems as well, because they will not be easily controlled. And so that's kind of the problem that we see now already and in the future going forward if we aren't able to actually control this and get this proper support for people that they need as cultivators, both commercially and in a home grow situation. So various pests that I want to talk about here. I don't talk about all of them here, or maybe most of them here. Yes, I have adapted um, this presentation, but some of the examples are that you should be aware of: the budworm moth, which is a generalist pest; the hemp russet mite, which is a specialist of cannabis in particular. It doesn't feed on other plants. The western flower thrips, which is a huge generalist; the cannabis aphid, which is itself a specialist; the rice root aphid, which is a generalist; the two-spotted spider mite, which is also a massive generalist; and also the silverleaf whitefly. These are pests that I often encounter in cannabis and is something that people should be aware of at the bare minimum because they are so common. You can find additional information in a chapter that I wrote called Integrated Pest Management Against Arthropod Pests of Cannabis Sativa in the United States of America in the book biopesticides in organic farming, recent advances. So the leaf miner fly, I'd already mentioned it earlier. As you can see here in this video on my channel, this is an example of, on the right, you can see the adult fly at the top and the bottom. And particularly that's a female. You can see because that little black dot near its abdomen is its ovipositor, or the little well, yeah, it is the ovipositor that uses to slice into the leaves and lay eggs. Those eggs, as you can see, become larvae, and you can see that this larva's story starts at the very left and moves to the very right as it feeds on the margin between the two sides of the leaf. And they are somewhat common, but I wouldn't consider them a particularly high threat. I have articulated all of the pests in this presentation as either high, medium, or low threat, or high, medium, low presence. And that refers to how likely they are to actually kill the plant outright or the crop outright for a threat, and how common how common I have seen it in both literature and my own experience. There are various biocontrols for this fly. If you do find that you get a particular population that is incessant and difficult, there are parasitoid wasps that are available commercially, like Diglyphus and Decnusa. And there's also a fungal pathogen that I'm very happy to talk about, which is called Beauveria bastiana. And that affects many other pests as well. And you'll see me talking about controlling various pests using this agent itself. So especially if you're used to organic practices, or you're trying to grow in a space where you're not using certain chemistries, then this can be a very good way to do that. Again, I had videos for this, but they're not accessible here in the presentation, but they are accessible on my YouTube channel. So another pest that I want to talk about are Formosan termites. So termites are not something people think about when it comes to cannabis pests. However, I've been seeing examples of termite damage on cannabis, on living cannabis, not just dead wood, which a lot of people are more familiar with. But Formosan termites have the really great successful trait of being able to attack living trees and other woody substances, as well as dead substances too. So they can do both. And that's incredibly destructive. And as you can see here, and everyone who has got their name on attached to things, they have all said it's okay to share this video and that sort of stuff. But you can see here on the left an example of a termite that is inside the stalk of a cannabis plant. And you can also see in the middle picture termites that are inhabiting a stalk as well. And that was also living material. But as you can see, they have girdled the stem and has just removed tons of the wood. That plant is not viable anymore. And if you research Formosan termites, you find that they have a great reputation for basically not being able to be controlled, even if you use harsh, noxious chemistries, which is why I consider their threat to be potentially very high. But the problem is that these termites are difficult to identify and get a hold of in a lot of cases. I am mostly making this identification based on the behavior that I'm seeing, but in true fashion, I haven't actually identified these particularly. I just think that they are Formosan termites based on the data and the behavior. And as some very, very lauded specialists have said, once established, Formosan subterranean termite has never been eradicated from an area. And this is from Dr. Nanyao Su and Dr. Rudolph H. Schefferin from the Entomology and Nematology Department of the University of Florida, which is a very competent university for pest research. So the two-spotted spider mite, very common. You can see in the picture here, you can see some webbing somewhat, but really that's somewhat invisible here. What you can really see are the white and orange eggs. White eggs are recently laid. Orange eggs are more mature and are likely to hatch soon. You can see a female two-spotted spider mite in the center there, and you can also see a smaller nymphal spider mite as well. And so that gives you an idea of how big they are. This is also on a cannabis leaf. They're extremely common in cannabis, also extremely common in many other plants. Their threat level is low, however. They can cause quite a bit of damage, and if they're left to go rampant, they can pretty quickly overrun the plant with a bunch of silk webbing, which is quite gross and sort of difficult to deal with. But it feeds on over 1,300 plant species documented. Many of those are crop plants, but not all of them. And I bring this up because your property and the local area where you're growing can be a vector for these spider mites. Since they can feed on so many different kinds of plants, you have to be very vigilant about the plants in and around your area. If you're only looking at your grow space, especially if it's an internal grow space, especially in a commercial or home grow setting, then you might not be considering the plants on your property or near your property. And even if you control the spider mites inside your cultivation section, if they're only like 5 feet away from your greenhouse, or if they're very close to any entrances to your grow space, then of course they're going to continue to come in. You'll have to constantly spray or apply biocontrols or do something else to abate them, which is very costly. So if you can avoid that by being vigilant and looking for the signs of their damage, which tends to be um, spotting damage and on the tops of leaves. If you flip over the leaves, you can find the spider mite colonies or other insects too that cause similar sorts of damage like thrips. So being vigilant and scouting your plants, both in your cultivation space and outside of it, is paramount. And here I have some examples of biocontrols. My favorite example is Persimilis. It tends to be the mite that I apply the most and that I recommend people apply the most. But there are other predatory mites and predatory insects that you can apply as well. You can also apply certain chemical controls like azadirachtin or wettable sulfur, although for the latter, actually really both, I would limit applying it in the flower space because that would be very problematic. The sulfur in particular, but also the azadirachtin as well. So using those in veg is much better, and using the biocontrols when you're closer to flower is preferred in my experience. But why are spider mites so problematic? Why and how do pests feed on healthy plants? This is a topic that I'm often asked, and so I want to use the spider mite as a good example for why this can be problematic. So spider mites and other insects and mites, for that matter, they are able to defeat plant defenses by oftentimes bypassing them. In the case of spider mites, they can actually produce a stylet. So they have this little feeding tube that they drink cell contents out of. They can actually push it through the stomata of a plant, which are these openings that plants make when they have to respire and release oxygen, right? And so they can actually not do any sort of physical damage to the plant sort of tissue at the surface and move through the stomata in order to suck out plant cells when they do penetrate them. So that can help evade and avoid the production of defense responses slightly. Of course, when they do damage the plant does detect this damage. But they also have other helpful compounds called effectors. As you can see in the diagram, that's what the E is here. And they basically they bind with other cellular architecture that is meant to detect signs and symptoms of damage, like what are called damage associated molecular patterns or herbivore associated molecular patterns. So these are things like the chitin that their body is made out of, right? It's a pretty big indicator. The plant's like, well, you're not supposed to be here, so that's going to raise the alarm bells. And other compounds in their saliva and things that are toxic or cause other sorts of problems. So the plant has a way to detect even the things that are meant to suppress its immune system. And sometimes this is really effective, and other times it is not super effective. But another thing to note is that spider mites and other insect pests, they do have a tendency to, because they reproduce very quickly and they're very adaptive, a lot of insects are able to detoxify plant compounds and things like this using their own biology and even their own microbiome. So what you end up happening or have happening is that a pest population can become resistant to the specific defenses of a certain species, and then they can hyper specialize. And we've seen this with spider mites on other crop plants, and it's possible that we also will see this or are already seeing this on cannabis in particular. From the research report, Why Do Herbivorous Mites Suppress Plant Defenses by Blazer and others, they say that we predict that in generalists confined to a host for extended periods of time, suppression trait will be replaced by resistance traits because these traits are ecologically more safe and, according to the data available, may promote mite performance more strongly. In some cases, spider mites actually adapt to elicit massive defensive responses, and they just take the brunt of it because they're able to do so, to able to detoxify compounds and things like this. But the reason why they might move from suppressing the immune system to adapting to elicit the immune system, because that actually makes them more competitive against other parasites on the plant, because they're not playing, there's no bad team, good team. They're not on the bad team pests and they're all working together. No, they're actually trying to feed on the plant themselves, and they're trying to limit and exclude other potential parasites as well. So they elicit the immune response, which tanks other pests but doesn't tank them. And that's just one example of adaptation that pests have to plant defenses. And if you're wondering why you're doing everything correctly and you still wind up with pests, this is one of the reasons why. So I find it very corrosive that a lot of people maybe become not very confident, or they are frustrated because they are indeed doing a lot of the things that they're supposed to be doing for pest response and biosecurity, and they still meet with resistance. And I want to say that this is one of the reasons why, and you shouldn't let it discourage you too much. Here's a better example of what I was talking about with spider mite adaptivity. So symbioses with microorganisms, or alternatively horizontal gene transfer events from microbes, where microbes literally have genes that help the host. They actually are taken out of the microbe, and are actually through various means they can be transferred to the host genome, and then they exist in the host and also its progeny. And that has happened many times for many organisms, including humans. So it may underlie an herbivore's ability to overcome plant defenses. And here you can see on the left of the diagram where the spider mites are inducing jasminic acid and salicylic acid, which are two hormones related to defense. And whereas in the central leaf, we have an example of them suppressing the immune response of the plant. And on the right, we have a collection of different populations. We have one that is liable to suppress the plant, which is the black one. We have those that are inducing defenses in the plant, which are like the regular colored two-spot spider mites. And then you have one that actually induces the plant response, but is also resistant to the plant defenses as well. And that one tends to be way more adaptive, and this is based on the genes. This is what the DEFT stands for. It's a gene for resistance, and this is compared to the wild type. So yeah, so as I was talking about earlier, these populations can hyper specialize on plants, and this might be something that we see happen in the future. So it's something to keep in mind now, in case it is already happening, or in for the future. So the budworm moth, threat high, presence high. You can take a look at some of the videos I've made about them on my channel. It is probably the most pestiferous pest in North American cannabis cultivation. Many people are dealing with this problem because the caterpillars themselves are the real issue. The moth itself has to lay the eggs on the plant. So in order for you to avoid that, you have to have some sort of shelter, maybe like a mesh screen, for example, or netting. And you have to apply the netting in such a way that the moths still can't reach with their ovipositor onto the leaves, because these caterpillars don't travel. Other caterpillars do, but as soon as these caterpillars are laid as eggs and hatch, they spend relatively very short time feeding on the outside leaves before they start to bore into the flower material or other sorts of like stem material. And that when they do that, they are very difficult to reach with surface contact killer insecticides. People don't want to use systemics, of course, so those are off the table. Even biocontrols are difficult to apply and have a great effect because, again, they shelter themselves inside the plant. And on top of that, much like the hemp borer that we're also going to talk about, if you do kill the caterpillar, you still don't win because the caterpillar will now be a dead caterpillar rotting in the stem of the plant. And if that happens, or the bud of the plant, which will vector pathogens and will also cause the fouling of bud material, which is, of course, the product that you're trying to avoid damaging. So in reality, physical barriers are the way that you have to avoid this plant entirely. And in large fields, this is not really optimal. And so it's a massive challenge for people in the commercial space. If you're a home grower, it might be a little bit easier for you to avoid the problem. But again, if you do want to apply biocontrols as well, you have examples of like a fungal pathogen like Eiseria or Beauveria. You can use trichogramma waspae, which go after the eggs themselves and not the larvae. Or you can use what are called nucleopolyhedrosis viruses, which are a more common product that is a specialist, naturally occurring viral pathogen that you can apply. It doesn't affect other organisms, it only affects the caterpillars. And that is also an example that you can use. But in all three of these cases, they are sort of difficult and aren't very effective unless you're applying it before you get the moth. So in that case, it's important to know when the moth becomes active in your area. When they are present, you can apply traps and pheromone lures in order to sort of test and see if the moths are very common in your area or not. And at that point, based on information that you can get from your local extension agency for agriculture or something like this, you can kind of make a plan with your IPM strategy as to when the moths are likely to show up, when you should start applying biocontrols and other control procedures, so that you're not caught, in a compromising situation. So the Eurasian hemp borer, threat is high, presence is medium. Again, the video you can find on my YouTube channel. It is very similar sort of story to the budworm moth, except that they are very much more common to get into the stem itself and to move up the stem, damaging tissues that are meant to sort of translocate sugars and nutrients and that sort of a thing. So they basically girdle the plant from the inside, and they cause the tops of the plants to sort of, lose cohesion and die very rapidly. So I wanted to put a lot of emphasis on these two moths because they are very common and very damaging, and there aren't a whole lot of good solutions for them for the same reason I said for the budworm moths. Fungus gnats, really common. Prodigious species in particular, the darkwing fungus gnats. I would say their threat is medium. A lot of people say that they're low threat, but I call them a medium threat because they can vector pathogens. And research has shown they can vector things like botrytis, which causes bud rot. They can vector pythium, fusarium, which are also important pathogens that are common in plants, and also very, very damaging. But for biocontrols and chemical controls, you can apply various things. My favorite thing to apply are predatory nematodes like Steinernema feltiae, which I don't know why the species name isn't italicized here, but you can also apply Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis, which is a bacterial pathogen. There are several BT pathogens for bacteria, but israelensis is one that is specific for fly larvae. And so that is the one that you want to use for the fungus gnat, which is a fly. You can also use controls like azadirachtin or pyrethrin as well, but those will also disrupt biocontrols that you want to keep. They also can disrupt other pests as well. So sometimes it makes sense to synergize, and sometimes it makes sense to apply the chemical controls first and then follow up with biocontrols, which is a pretty common 1-2 punch. Western flower thrips. I have a very good video about them on my channel. I would call their threat low, but their presence is very high, especially in California and Southern California in my experience. They feed on many different kinds of plants, and the western flower thrips in particular. You can see on the right its damage. It causes this sort of silvering blotchiness. They're often found on the bottoms of leaves, but you can also find them on the top, especially when populations are high. This sort of stippling damage is what's called, and the black liquid dots are actually the excreta. It's called frass, and so that's the remains of the food that they're eating, and you can tell them from other insects like aphids, for example, or springtails, because they have this sort of fusiform cigar shape to them, and the adults have these wings, and they're very, very agile. They're liable to flutter around and escape if you disturb them too much. So they are kind of a little bit difficult to deal with in that way. And even if you spray something, it can be kind of ineffective because uh, they're so quick to flee essentially. So what the biocontrols I like to use for these are Swirsky or Coumarous mites in the foliage. You can also use Hypoaspis miles, uh, or a similar kind of predatory mite like Stratiolalaps in the soil, because when they pupate, when the larvae are done feeding, they turn into this sort of inactive form, which can sometimes drop into the soil. And the best biocontrol strategies tend to target multiple life stages at once as much as possible. So you're attacking them at the egg stage, at the larval stage, at the pupal stage, at the adult stage, when possible, so that every single stage is having pressure put onto them. You can also use some of the similar chemical controls I said earlier. Again, considering using in flower less like wettable sulfur, pyrethrin, and azadirachtin, and using them more in veg. So the rice root aphid, very, very common as well. Threat medium, presence high. I have many videos about the rice root aphid, and I was going to use this video as an illustration, but essentially, um, I want you to note that in the species name, it's called Rufi abdominale. Sorry. The Rufi in Rufi abdominale stands for red. Rice root aphids, you'll know, are what they are because of this bulbous aphid form in the roots, of course. But if you're having trouble still identifying them, you should note that the abdomens have this sort of reddish spotting. And even though the main color can be black or green or an orangish yellow coloration, um, they tend to always keep this sort of like reddish hue on the back of their abdomen. So that is one way you can indicate and tell them from other species if you're still having trouble identifying them. And there's several biocontrols. Chrysopora lacewings are very common, but a lot of arthropods, so like other insect biocontrols, they're ill-suited for attacking them in the soil. At that time, if you do find that you have a colony of them on your roots, it's best to use something like a fungal pathogen like Beauveria bassiana or Eiseria fumosoracea, which are very common commercial products. But you can also use certain chemical controls as well, but you have to be very careful to not damage the roots as well. Follow the label instructions where possible. The cannabis aphid is right up there with the rice root aphid, is one of the two massive and major aphid pests that I foresee becoming much more problematic in the future because they reproduce very quickly, and in the case of the cannabis aphid, are specialized on cannabis. So as cannabis crops will increase, so too will the cannabis aphid most likely. You can see at the top an example of a cannabis aphid with a small globule, maybe an alarm compound or a defense compound coming out of what's called the cornicle, which is an aphid structure. These sort of what often people like to call tailpipes or other sorts of structures. Those allow the aphid to sort of protect itself and produce these sort of defensive compounds. So if it's disturbed, they oftentimes produce them. At the bottom, you can see you can see an aphid with wings. Aphid adults don't always have wings, but at certain times of the year, especially when they're moving from spring to autumn, they will develop wings, especially when plants move to senesce and they start to get old and the nutrient profile is different. That lets the aphid know that it's time to find new hosts and to deposit new aphid populations that will perhaps lay eggs even, or will be able to overwinter. So aphids produce also honeydew as waste. This is also true for rice root aphids. And that honeydew waste uh, can be a vector for what's called sooty mold. So sometimes when you're looking for pests, you'll find like sticky substance, which is a dead giveaway that it's a hemipteran. So like an aphid or a scale insect or something that produces this sticky, sugary liquid. Ants are often attracted to it. And sooty molds, which are black usually, will also kind of grow on the honeydew. They aren't pathogens of the plants, but they can be an excellent indicator that the aphid is in your canopy space. And a lot of the same biocontrols are relevant here, and perhaps more relevant because they will not grow, or they will not go into the roots themselves. So various parasitoid wasps, like you can see on the left side, which are quite small but are very deadly for the aphid, as well as lacewing larvae, for example, or some of those fungal pathogens are also effective. Silverleaf whitefly. Threat and presence are both medium here because silverleaf whiteflies in particular vector tons of viruses of plants. And one of them, the lettuce sclerosis virus, is newly documented in cannabis and is lethal. So it's very important to be aware of this factor. I typically don't see silverleaf whiteflies vectoring them currently, but it doesn't mean that it can't happen. And in this picture, although you can't see it because it's quite blurry, you can see it better on the YouTube channel. This is a whitefly that has broad mites on the legs. Specifically, this species and not other relative species are attractive to broad mites. They are actually attracted to the wax on their bodies, and they use them as vehicles. So when the whitefly moves from one colony to another and catches air, the broad mites follow, and sometimes you can get a double whammy of broad mites and whiteflies as well. Something to consider. So when you're controlling for whiteflies, you're actually controlling for the whitefly, potentially broad mite, as well as Liz sclerosis virus, and possibly other viruses too. We don't know very much about the cannabis virome, but there are other various biocontrols like Delphasis catalini, Swirskyii, Cucumeris, and also Beauveria, which I'm very fond of using for whiteflies in particular because they like to group up and the fungus is very effective against them. Broad mites, like I said, these are a massive problem. The big takeaway is that they will definitely kill your crop if you're not careful. Them and russet mites, which they are often confused for, are both high threat pests. Both of them cause a sort of corrugated, gnarled, wrinkled look on the leaves, which you can see on the right side. And in the case of broad mites, you can tell them from russet mites because they have a American football shaped body. And they also lay eggs that have these little tubercle structures on them that look like dots, which you can see in the picture here. And that is a surefire way to know that you're dealing with broad mites versus other mites like russet mites, for example. They both, though, produce a toxic substance in the saliva that causes this damage. So even if you're able to control the plant problem or the pest, you might still end up with a plant that has these sorts of immune response problems. And they can grow out of it, but it can stunt the growth for a period of time. So you definitely don't want to allow this to happen in the first place. I love to use Swirsky or Cucumeris mites against them personally. I find it is very effective, and usually at a rate of like 2 to 300 per meter squared is effective. Similarly, russet mites, whereas broad mites feed on a ton of different plants, russet mites only feed on specific plants. And the hemp russet mite feeds on cannabis. Believe it or not, most russet mites are actually not a big deal for their plant hosts, but a few of them are. And unfortunately, several of them feed on plants that we care about, like citrus and that sort of a thing. Just like broad mites, they can travel on equipment, plants, and also air currents. Russet mites are often, because they are so dang small, they actually can be carried up on wind and they can move a short distance or a far distance, depending on how that happens. So if you're wondering if you're doing everything right, why rusted mites are still getting in, that is one of the reasons why it could be happening. And then here we have an example of major microbial pests, which I think I only have a few minutes to talk about. So I'm going to go through this rapid fire. You can also find additional information on my chapter called Viral Diseases of Hemp, Cannabis sativa, from the book Viral Diseases of Field and Horticultural Crops. And examples are lettuce powdery mildew, Fusarium oxysporum, Aspergillus fumigatus, bud rot, Botrytis cinerea, beet curly-top virus, lettuce sclerosis virus, hop latent viroid, and cannabis cryptic virus. Lettuce powdery mildew, there are a few different ones. There's lettuce powdery mildew and hop powdery mildew that were recently found on cannabis. Their threat level is low. They tend to not kill their plant that they parasitize, but their presence is high, and of course causes problems on flower material, stunts growth, and things like this. I highly encourage you to learn about how they infect. They are epiphytes. They are not endophytes. They do not systemically infect the plant, like, for example, Fusarium or Pythium can do. There are several biocontrols, a couple actually, but chemical controls are much more common, like potassium bicarbonate or wettable sulfur. And resistance in the plants is oftentimes very variable. So certain cultivars may be more resistant and some of them might be less resistant. And we don't really have a lot of the technical ability to assess that. So you have to be very careful as a cultivator when people make claims about whether a plant is actually resistant. You should ask for data and empirical evidence when possible. But a lot of times this is not available currently, so we have to do the best that we can with our limited options. The curly-top virus, again, highly recommend you check out the video because I talk about where it's found, which is Graham County. They were found in Colorado, for example, like I think Delta County, Colorado, and also in Arizona, like in Graham County. So if you cultivate in that area, then you should know that BCTV, which is found in tons of different kinds of plants, is also a pest of cannabis, and it is vectored by the beet leafhopper. And it's the main vector. It's really practically the only viable vector of BCTV. And so if you're growing in places where people are growing beets or they're growing many other plants in agricultural space, then you should be considering this as a potential problem for you because there's no conventional treatment for this or lettuce sclerosis virus. LCV. So it's vectored by the silver leaf whitefly, like we already said. It causes massive chlorosis in the plant, and it also doesn't have any conventional treatment as well. So if you're dealing with plants that you can't afford to lose, you should be very careful about exposing them to pests because some of these pests vector incurable viruses that are lethal. And that's it. That's the Cannabis Pest Update 2021. And again, if you'd like to find more information, if you'd like to contact me for professional services, you can find me on zenthanol.com. You can also find me and ask for help and other sorts of things on my Instagram or my Twitter at SyncAngel. I love to help people out, as well as on my YouTube channel, Zenthanol, where I update and produce a lot of my videos about plant health. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Up next, we have Arby Barroso. We will be back on.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Up next, we got Arby Barroso, and he's going to go ahead and do a presentation. He's a cannabis entrepreneur and a co-founder of Green Roads and many other up and exciting businesses. Arby Barroso, you're up next. Hope everyone's enjoying this presentation.
Hey guys, I hope you guys could hear me.